Ku Chai Hobo Ben Cat. In the dry season of 1966, the red earth split into jagged cracks and the low forest was woven tight like an old underground vein. The U.S. units moving in thought, they were only up against ambushes, booby traps, and a few scattered snipers. 3 weeks later, every assumption collapsed. Bravo 3 was shot at from behind, even though the area had already been cleared. Charlie 5 lost 2 men in a stretch of woods marked no activity. Near Hobo, a 105mm gun crew was hit in broad daylight. The surviving officer said the gunfire echoed up from the ground and then vanished back below. American soldiers called the phenomenon ghost fire. The veterans on the ground had a better name, the Underground War. The tunnels were not shallow foxholes. They were a multi-level system, meeting chambers, weapons caches, medical stations, emergency exits, shortcuts, air vents stretching for dozens of kilometers, like an underground city built over generations. One soldier joked half serious, "We're fighting an army," at a different address. The problem was that the enemy always appeared at the right place at the right moment, then disappeared before U.S. firepower could react. Artillery lost targets, armor lost angles, infantry lost line of sight. And once those 3 advantages were stripped away, the Americans had to accept they were fighting on a plane entirely against them. In America's previous battlefields, from the Ardennes to Korea, threats came from the front or from the air. In Vietnam, they came from beneath their feet. The lessons of firepower formations, suppression, suddenly meant nothing against an enemy fighting on a level the U.S. had never had to consider. In a report by the 27 Battalion, an officer wrote just one line: "The thing that kills you is the space that lies beyond your sight." On August 14th, a company from the 25th Division entered a forest patch near the Song Tra stream. All traces had been wiped clean. At 11:47, the ground in front of the point man dipped slightly. A dark hole opened. 2 bursts of AK fire shot straight up from barely half a meter below. Just a few inches of earth were enough to hide 2 men. U.S. artillery hit back, shaking the forest, but the tunnels held. 10 minutes later, the enemy appeared at another spot 200 meters away, then vanished again. In the briefing room in Tay Ninh, the map was filled with red casualty marks, but there were no lines connecting them, no pattern explaining why they were linked. The information existed, but meant nothing, because the enemy kept shifting locations. 3 companies, 8 platoons, dozens of casualties, all from tunnel mouths smaller than a soldier's helmet brim. When the Americans advanced, the enemy had already moved. When the Americans pulled back, they returned. To survive, a new front had to be opened underground. Only one question remained: how do you fight in a battlefield made entirely of darkness? The emergency meeting inside the field command hut took place in 98-degree heat, the ceiling fan rattling like it might fall at any moment. On the table, reports were stacked in layers: tunnel ambushes, lost air vents, missing movement trails. The enemy slipped underground, while the Americans were trapped on the surface, a gap that seemed small, but was enough to make every firepower advantage meaningless. Everything they brought into the jungle: smoke, tear gas, seismic sensors, drills. Cameras failed one by one. The problem was that the underground environment followed none of the rules the Americans were familiar with. Smoke escaped through dozens of hidden vents beneath tree roots. Vibration sensors couldn't tell footsteps from distant artillery. Thermal cameras were blinded by the heat of the soil. Probe drills kept hitting false layers. After 3 weeks, everything pointed to one conclusion: if they wanted to know what was moving beneath their feet, someone had to crawl down there themselves. No technology could replace the instinct of a real human body in the dark. At the end of the meeting, Reeves simply placed his pen on the map and said, "To survive, we have to open a new front directly under the ground." The Americans on the surface were trained to locate lock-on and overwhelm targets with firepower. But underground, every one of those skills became a burden. Down there, targets were almost impossible to find. Support from helicopters or nearby units meant nothing. Anyone entering the tunnels would have to learn from scratch, to move slowly, to hear instead of see, to sense instead of observe. It was nothing like the kind of war the U.S. Army was built for. Counter-tunnel ops began at that moment. On September 2nd, inside a tin hut hot like a furnace, Lieutenant Colonel Harris called an emergency meeting. He got straight to the point, his voice rough from days without sleep. "We need people willing to go where the machines give up." Everyone stayed silent, looking at one another. He added one more line that ended all debate. From now on, this is the condition for survival. The selection took place that same afternoon, so simple it felt cold. No paperwork review, no tactical simulations. Just one question repeated to each man: are you afraid of confined spaces? Anyone tall or broad-shouldered was dismissed. Anyone who panicked when the lights went out was dismissed. Anyone who trembled when locked inside a 60-centimeter wooden box was dismissed. In the end, only a few remained small, compact, quiet men who walked lightly and whose eyes adjusted easily to the dark. Jenkins was one of them, slight, thin, easy to overlook in formation, but steady breathing inside the test box. Diaz, a radio repairman with quick hands. Morgan, raised on a farm full of mice, who half joked, "If I were scared of them, I'd have died a long time ago." The three became the first members of the new company, the Tunnel Rats. Training began that very night. They built a mock tunnel section from sandbags and wood, only 60 centimeters wide, with no guidance from manuals or veterans with first-hand experience. The technical officer gave them just 3 rules. Don't keep the light on for more than 3 seconds. Don't move both hands at the same time. Don't turn your head inside the tunnel. Their gear was minimal to the point of bare, a short-barreled .38. A knife, a dim red flashlight, a marking cord, 1 smoke canister, and a small radio. Everything fit into a light leather bag weighing 3 kilos. All they had on their bodies was a sweat-soaked fatigue set. A lieutenant looked at the kit and asked, "That's it?" Harris simply answered, "Yes, that's the most suitable you're going to get." The night before their first mission, the 6 tunnel rats sat under a weak lamp, sharpening knives and testing their flashlights. Everyone knew exactly what waited below: darkness, damp air, thin oxygen traps, and an enemy at arm's length distance. At 23:40, Reeves spread the map and pointed at a newly discovered tunnel entrance on the edge of the Iron Triangle air vents, footprints freshly turned soil. When Jenkins asked, "What if we run into 2 people down there?" Reeves only said, "There's only room for 1. At 00 to 12, they approached the tunnel, mouth no bigger than an animal burrow. Fresh-cut bamboo ends still stuck out of the dirt. Moist air rose with the smell of old soil. Jenkins tied the guide rope to a tree. Diaz checked the flashlight. Morgan tightened his grip on the .38. Jenkins lowered his head, pressed his shoulders in, and slipped down in 3 seconds. Diaz followed immediately. Morgan went last. The earth closed around them like a door that opened only once. The moment the last body disappeared from the surface, light counter tunnel. Ops officially began a new front where the 3 men had to move through a cramped space where every breath could give away their position. A single mistake meant the end. The tunnel opening was so narrow that Jenkins had to tilt his shoulders just to slip through. The first layer of soil broke cold and sticky, clinging to his neck, his hands even the edge of his shirt, making every touch against the earth heavier. The drop was only half a meter deep, but the space closed around him so fast it forced him to adjust his breathing. Down here, any rush could turn into a fatal mistake. In World War II, American troops fought in many environments: trenches, dense forests, ruined cities, but never in a place where the enemy could be directly under the ground, only an arm's length away. The Vietnamese tunnel system was a combat ecosystem, a dimension American soldiers had never experienced. Above him, Diaz lowered the marking line and Morgan held the entrance while Jenkins cleared the path. He flashed the red light for exactly 3 seconds, just enough to confirm the tunnel was under 60 centimeters wide, curving slightly to the right, and the first thing returning to him was the scraping sound of rats. The light went out. Jenkins moved using only his fingertips every centimeter, controlled and deliberate. The next 3 meters, the soil changed from loose to packed to sign the tunnel had been reinforced. Jenkins signaled Diaz slid down behind him at a distance of 40 centimeters, and Morgan stayed at the anchor point above. The second flash revealed a standard layout: the main passage forward, a low side passage on the left, and near the ceiling, a thumb-sized air vent. Wherever all 3 were present, someone was definitely nearby. Jenkins entered the main passage, probing the ceiling with the tip of his knife. When the blade touched something rigid, he knew it was a needle trap. A soft click confirmed it. He bent the wire back to disable it. Diaz whispered behind him, "Easy." Jenkins didn't answer. The soil ahead had changed to soft, hollow underneath. A collapse pit. A familiar trap about 1.5 meters deep enough to trap a man and end in small charges or upward stakes. Jenkins shifted right anchor to marking rope to signal the safe route. He crawled another 3 meters. The air changed sharply. There was human breathing. He froze, pressing Diaz still. A figure moved across the side passage. No, face only the brush of cloth against soil. Jenkins flashed the light for 1 second to signal back. The figure slipped into another branch immediately. They were watching, measuring how far the Americans could go and in which direction. At the 10th meter, he stopped completely. In front of him was a 3-way chamber, the ideal place for diversions or traps. The wall soil was fresh. It's still warm. Someone had passed through moments ago. Moving farther meant accepting the risk of being struck from only 0.5 meter below. Jenkins began mapping everything in his head. Main passage side, passage vent, space 6 meters apart. Needle trap in the ceiling, 1.5 meter collapse pit, fresh soil layered markings. The air shifted again, oxygen dropped sharply, Jenkins's lungs tightening like a wet blanket pressed over them. A metallic taste crept into his mouth, the sign of severe low oxygen. Under the dim red glow, he saw Diaz gasping, sweat dripping in heavy beads onto the dirt. Another 2 minutes and they would pass out before anything else happened. Jenkins signaled the retreat. Diaz gathered the rope, and Morgan pulled them both up. When they broke out of the tunnel mouth, the night sky hung over the forest like a thick canvas sheet. Jenkins wrote down the entire structure they had encountered, ending with no contact yet, but it seems they're watching us. Reeves read it and said only, "This is just the first phase. From here on, they'll change tactics." Jenkins replied, "Then we'll have to do the same." The cycle beneath the ground began that moment. 3 days after Jenkins's team pulled out of the first tunnel, they returned. But the old tunnel was gone. The entrance had been sealed flat with packed soil, and 50 meters away, a new opening had appeared, smaller, hidden under the roots of a strangler fig and ice cold. Reeves looked over the site and said simply, "They're redesigning." At 14:00, Jenkins, Diaz, and Morgan went down the tunnel. By the first meter, they realized the rules had changed. The tunnel diameter had shrunk to the point their chests scraped the ground, forcing them to crawl on their elbows. The turns were sharper to block any straight-line shot. Red light flashed for 3 seconds, clay mixed with bamboo roots reinforced against collapse. At the 10th meter, the air shifted again. The musty forest smell vanished, replaced by the burnt scent of oil and stove ash. Level 2, Morgan whispered. They had entered the workshop zone. The walls were carved wider here, soot streaked the ceiling, and small alcoves held tools. But no people. This silence was more unsettling than gunfire. Jenkins felt along the walls with his fingertips. He touched something soft and slimy, a small cloth pouch filled with fire ants sealed shut. It had been placed at face level, waiting to be brushed against. A tactic meant to break a man's nerves by pushing pain into a confined space. Jenkins trembled as he scraped it down with his knife, and even that brief moment sent cold sweat running down his back. Then he found a trapdoor cleverly disguised beneath loose soil. When he lifted it slightly, a wave of heat rushed against his face, the warmth of human activity. They decided to drop to level 3. At this depth, the sense of time and space warped. Level 3 was roomier. They could crouch walk. Diaz scanned with the light. It was a massive logistics depot. Stacks of wooden crates, field telephone wires running along the walls, and a leveled corner set up as a field surgery station. Suddenly, Diaz gripped Jenkins' ankle and tugged twice the signal to stop immediately. Ahead, only 5 meters away, a solid wall of earth shifted. A hidden panel slid open. A dim yellow glow from an oil lamp spilled out, and muffled voices drifted through. The enemy wasn't patrolling. They were holding a meeting right next door. But the worst part was behind them. Morgan, the last in line, felt the faint draft from the entrance above suddenly cut off. The air pressure changed. They closed the top, Morgan whispered, voice breaking. "We're locked in." It was a trap. The enemy had known they entered and silently sealed the exit to capture them inside this glass box. Jenkins made the decision, instantly change the retreat path, avoid the old route. Jenkins slammed his notebook, still smeared with red mud, onto the map table. He pointed at the red marks. "That's not a set of shelters. That's a city. Workshops on level 2, storage on level 3, and they know how to herd us like rats into traps." Reeves studied Jenkins's sketch layered system, rear shut-off trap doors disguised escape vents. He understood then that every current Tool Scout dog smoke grenades was useless against something this complex. "We have to drop the old playbook," Reeves said, his voice low. "To beat this, we treat it as its own battlefield." That same night, under dim oil lamps, the Subterranean Warfare Composite Team, SWCT, the Underworld Unit, was officially created based on what Jenkins had just survived. Harris drew 3 large arrows on the board, mapping rats like Jenkins and Diaz. Mission: no engagement. Memorize structure, soil density airflow, and recreate the map mentally. Pressure teams: use bulldozers and surface shock charges to force the enemy deeper or expose vent points. Cut teams: the key unit. Using the mapping rat's data, they drill or dig straight down into junction nodes like the spot where Jenkins was almost cut off to place charges. Goal: sever communication between tunnel levels. Harris looked at the entire group and delivered the line that shifted the underground war's direction. "From today on, we're going down there to destroy their architecture." Jenkins stared at his own still trembling hands. He knew the real game had only just begun, and the next time they went down, the enemy would be even more dangerous. On September 7th, Baker 1 team entered a tunnel mouth 2 kilometers from Jenkins's position. The tunnel was shallow, barely deeper than a man's height, supposedly easy. They disappeared from radio contact after 10 minutes. When the rescue team arrived, all they found was a neatly severed marking line and a widened air vent just big enough for a person to slip through. No gunfire, no struggle, only a chilling, clean disappearance. Reeves inspected the scene, tension etched across his face. From that day on, Jenkins understood one thing clearly: the enemy down there had begun hunting them back. The eastern forest line of the Iron Triangle was soaked with heavy moisture. After 3 days of tracking the new tunnel route, Jenkins led the team back to the same wooden stake where they had previously pierced through a hollow section. This time, they were not there to survey. They were there to cut the heartbeat of the entire tunnel cluster before the enemy could reinforce it. Before they went down, Reeves said only one line: "The lower levels aren't like the upper ones. If we wait until morning, this route will regenerate." Their formation included a new addition: Lewis, a young engineer known for surgeons' hands when disarming mines. Jenkins tightened his harness. Morgan checked the backup airbag. Diaz inspected the .38. Everything was done in silence. The tunnel entrance was low and narrow. Jenkins went first, Lewis in the middle, Diaz, and Morgan locking the rear. The first level was fast and empty, a sign the enemy wanted them to go deeper. Level 2 was warm and dense with the smell of ash. In the first chamber, a brief flash of Jenkins's red light showed a freshly scraped mark on the left wall, proof that a connecting branch had just been opened. Jenkins knew this was the target they were ordered to destroy. 7 more meters in the soil shifted from soft to compressed, then to dried clay. Morgan stopped when his knife struck a hollow bamboo tube embedded horizontally in the ceiling, a signal the enemy was monitoring this route. The retreat path was already compromised. Jenkins headed straight for the junction. The third chamber opened into a node nearly a meter-wide low ceiling, with 2 passages leading downward. Morgan prepared the C4. Diaz set the detonator. Jenkins brushed aside the soil, exposing the support beam, old dry wood, holding the whole connecting artery together. Just as he placed the first charge, the sound beneath his feet changed. The soil shifted sideways. Someone was crawling up from below. They couldn't fire or throw grenades. Diaz armed the timer. Morgan planted the second charge. Jenkins pulled the firing cord tight. They backed out in short, controlled movements. Near the second step upward, a slide of earth sounded. The enemy was only a few feet behind them. Jenkins flashed the red light for 1 second to blind the figure below, then triggered the blast. The tunnel beneath them collapsed instantly. Dirt flooded inward, the ceiling cracked, and hot air surged upward. There was no reaction, only a deep rumble as the junction snapped apart. "It's done." "Move," Jenkins ordered, relief in his voice. They crawled back toward the entrance in the same formation. A faint glow appeared 15 meters ahead. Fresh air rushed in. The tension finally eased. They thought they were clear. But as Lewis passed under a cluster of strangler fig roots, a section they had thoroughly checked, on the way in the soil above him, suddenly split open. A hidden spider hole hatch snapped upward. A bamboo spear coated with toxin shot straight down, piercing the gap between Lewis's shoulder plate and neck. The young engineer didn't even get out a sound. He jolted like a hooked fish and collapsed dark blood, spilling and blocking the route behind Morgan and Diaz. Ambush. In the ceiling, Jenkins shouted, spinning around and firing into the darkness above Lewis. Dirt burst outward, but the hidden hatch slammed shut instantly. The attacker was gone, as if he had never existed, leaving Lewis's body wedged in the narrow 60-centimeter crawl space. Pulling Lewis out of that tunnel was a nightmare. They had to crawl backward while dragging his harness, his blood making everything slick, the heavy smell of death mixing with the gunpowder fumes. When they finally surfaced, no one had the heart to celebrate. Reeves stared at Lewis's cold body, the most meticulous man in the unit, then at Jenkins, whose face was smeared with his teammates' blood. They were waiting, Jenkins' said voice, shaking with anger and fear. They let us go, and let us plant the charges. They waited for the moment we thought we were done to strike. The mission succeeded. The eastern tunnel route was cut, but the cost shattered the team's confidence. A brutal lesson carved itself into the minds of the survivors underground. Even when you think you're the hunter, you might already be the prey. 25 hours after the junction was blown, the eastern forest of the Iron Triangle was quieter than usual. For regular infantry, it was a rare calm. For the counter-tunnel teams, it was only a sign that the system was rebalancing itself. At 1840, Reeves spread the map over a sheet of nylon. The tunnel network showed two clear sectors. The east had dropped sharply in activity, while the west held its usual rhythm. He pointed at the red zone. We cut one branch. Now, we need to find out where they're rebuilding. Recon gave the answer sooner than expected. At 1912, fresh soil appeared 300 meters north of the collapse point. The shovel marks were steady organized. For the enemy, losing a junction simply meant rerouting, not a fatal hit. Along the new soil trail, tiny vent holes appeared in the direction of the wind, and tree roots had been cut clean. Jenkins pressed a patch of warm earth. They're opening a bypass, he said. Morgan added, could be linking level 2 to level 3. Jenkins shook his head. Not linking. Keeping the rhythm. Reeves deployed the pressure team with the old ADSID set. The goal this time was to detect changes in ground patterns. 3 sensor stakes were driven in. The screen showed a low, steady vibration, the signature of several people digging inside a large chamber. The data indicated the underground structure was swelling northward. That night, scouts captured a Vietnamese man at the western edge of the forest. In his pocket was only a single sheet of thin pulp paper with a hurried message: Eastern Junction lost. Level 2, opening branch north. Reeves read it, quietly crushed the paper, and dropped it into the oil lamp flame. He turned toward the thick darkness covering the forest. On the map, he crossed out the words neutralized east sector, replacing them with a large question mark. Outside, Jenkins leaned against the hull of an M113, trying to doze after 20 straight hours awake. He tried to let his body loosen, but sleep wouldn't come. Through the cold steel track plates and the hard-packed ground beneath him, a faint rhythmic vibration pulsed up his spine. Thump, thump, thump. Not a heartbeat. It was digging. 6 meters under the ground, they were still working right beneath where he lay. Reeves gave the order at 10 a.m. Check the northern branch. Light tremors detected, likely they were digging to reconnect the line. Jenkins led the team down. This time they brought Parker, the smallest man in the unit, filling the gap Lewis left behind. The tunnel mouth was narrow, the soil dry, and loose, unusually easy to move through. By the 20th meter, they passed a sharp Z-shaped bend. Suddenly, a deep sliding sound came from behind them. It was the sound of tons of soil dropping at once. Morgan, taking the rear, choked out cave-in. They turned back. The exit was gone. A solid wall of earth sealed the passage completely. Morgan probed it with his knife, then shook his head in despair. They collapsed the support wall. We're sealed in. The 60-centimeter space instantly became a coffin. Oxygen turned into a luxury. Jenkins forced himself to stay calm and shine the light forward. The only remaining path was a narrow shaft dropping steeply into the darkness. They want to drive us down, Jenkins said, cold sweat breaking across his forehead. Stay here and we suffocate. Move. They crawled into the black throat of the passage. The deeper they went, the heavier and thicker the air became. Their ears rang. This depth had to be more than 6 meters aplace. American military doctrine considered barely survivable. But below, there was airflow. Jenkins' boots touched a flat floor. He flicked the red light on, partially covered by his hand. Before them lay a chamber, wide, high-ceilinged, reinforced with polished red-brown hardwood beams. In the center sat a low wooden table. Pinned to the earth walls were dozens of thin pulp paper notes and U.S. military maps marked with red ink. In the corner, a captured PRC-25 radio still showed a faint power light. A teapot wrapped in a vehicle tarp cover was still warm. Jenkins looked around. There was no open flame. The entire room was lit by an oil lamp, hidden inside a recessed pit. A hidden lamp, well projecting its glow upward, so no light leaked outside or through any vent. Even with tunnel-trained eyes, he couldn't make out the far corners. Everything was only shadow and blurred edges. God? Parker whispered, his hands trembling. This is the command center. They had stumbled into Level 4, the brain of the system, the place issuing the orders that had tied U.S. forces in knots above ground. Suddenly, voices came from the right-hand wall, multiple people, footsteps thudding, weapons clinking. The enemy was returning, or checking the trap they had just sprung. The tunnel rats were standing in the heart of the enemy's stronghold, surrounded by layers of earth and likely hundreds of fighters. Jenkins scanned frantically. His eyes caught a shadowed corner behind the map. Stand the wall, there had a faint upside-down U-shaped crack, patched neatly with wet soil, not a vent. An emergency hatch, a special escape line for commanders, just wide enough for one person, usually leading to fake termite mounds or dense bamboo clusters. This way, break the wall, he ordered sharply. Diaz lunged forward and smashed the butt of his pistol into it. The camouflage layer broke open, revealing a vertical shaft and with small footholds carved into the sides. Go move. Diaz boosted Parker up first. Morgan pushed Jenkins. The moment Jenkins' boot cleared the shaft opening, a powerful flashlight beam swept across the chamber below. Shouts erupted. Movement seal. The exits. The chase turned vertical inside the pitch-black shaft. The team had to cling to the tiny footholds, like lizards dragging themselves upward. The narrow walls scraped their shoulders. Gear thudded against the dirt. Below, rifle fire blasted upward into the shaft, spraying soil and debris into their faces. Morgan caught a fragment in his calf, but didn't dare cry out. Stopping meant all of them would be trapped and finished. They burst onto the surface in the middle of a dense clump of thorny bamboo, almost 400 meters from where they had entered. All four collapsed, gasping faces, pale, covered in dirt and blood. Their hearts pounded like they were about to tear free from their ribs. They had escaped the jaws of the tiger. Back at the command hut, Reeves looked at their torn, filthy state, ready to ask about the destruction mission. Jenkins dropped to the ground, hands shaking as he lit a cigarette, and tossed a crumpled pulp paper note onto the table, something he had grabbed from the command room. We didn't destroy anything, sir, but we found something more important. He took a long drag, eyes still haunted by the darkness below. We found their brain. And it's deeper than anything we imagined. Level 4 was untouched, but its location was exposed. The fight shifted from cutting limbs to hunting the head. And now the fear came from knowing exactly what was waiting in the darkness below. The next morning, the eastern sector of the Iron Triangle was quieter than usual. A newcomer might think the raid on Level 4 had shut down all underground activity, but for anyone who had worked counter-tunnel, the silence meant only one thing: the system was waiting to stabilize. The tunnel entrance had been sealed with a thick layer of red earth. Jenkins checked the soil to see whether it still carried heat, the most basic sign of what was happening below. Morgan returned from the western side and reported faint readings on the ADSIDs. It was post-collapse disturbance. That alone told them the tunnels were still active. By noon, Jenkins reviewed his notebook. Old notes were constantly being replaced because the enemy's structure changed all the time. Diaz wondered how the opposing engineers dug so fast. Jenkins answered plainly: because they treated the tunnels as a living space, not a defensive position. Different concepts led to different ways of operating. By afternoon, scouts found a new entrance in the northeast. The traps were gone, and the soil was still warm. Listening to the ground, they detected low-frequency vibration, the signal of inspection and route opening. Reeves gave only a short confirmation they were restarting the network. When night fell, the camp was calm, but everyone remained tense. Counter-tunnel work depended on reaction speed. Jenkins sat under a tree and placed his hand on the ground. Tiny but distinct tremors. Enough to tell him they would be going back down in the morning. Over the next 2 months, Viet Cong units in the Iron Triangle had to rebuild their entire tunnel grid, deepening levels, spreading out storage, shifting vent routes, abandoning long-standing living routines. The enemy was no longer just a ghost underground. They had to become engineers, constantly reinforcing and repairing. Their ability to dictate ambushes had been broken. For the Americans, the tunnel rats left behind a bitter but unmistakable lesson. Some battlefields only yield to those willing to step into places where technology and firepower cannot follow. After the war, this experience became the foundation for modern urban and close-quarters operations from Fallujah to Mosul, where enemy forces again used underground layers and confined spaces. Counter-tunnel ops didn't change the outcome of the war, but it proved something. When the enemy chooses darkness as their refuge, only those who dare enter that darkness have any chance of dragging them out.